The autumn rain fell steadily against the windows of Baker Street that grey October morning when the courier arrived, soaked through and clutching a sealed envelope addressed to Sherlock Holmes in an impeccably precise hand. Holmes tore it open and read in silence, his sharp grey eyes scanning the lines twice before he passed it wordlessly to me. The letter bore the signature of Franklin, Butler to Lord Quentin Ashcombe of Ashcombe Manor, a man whose reputation for dignity and discretion was legendary throughout London's service circles. The message was brief, but conveyed unmistakable urgency. Lord Quentin Ashcombe had been found dead in his private study, under circumstances that the village constable had hastily declared natural causes. Yet Franklin, with decades of faithful service behind him, insisted something profoundly wrong had occurred. He entreated Holmes to come at once, before whatever darkness had descended upon Ashcombe Manor could claim further victims or fade beyond investigation. Before I continue with this remarkable case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support allows us to keep bringing these mysteries to you. Now, let us proceed. Holmes was on his feet within moments, his mind already racing through possibilities even as he reached for his traveling coat. We caught the next train westward, steaming through countryside increasingly obscured by rolling fog that seemed to swallow the landscape whole. The journey gave Holmes time to consider what little we knew, though he remained characteristically silent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he stared through the rain-streaked window at the vanishing world beyond. Ashcombe Manor loomed through the mist as our hired carriage approached, its stone facade grey and forbidding, flanked by ancient oaks whose bare branches clawed at the leaden sky. Twin stone lions guarded the entrance, their weathered faces seeming to watch our approach with silent judgment. The iron gates stood open, but the house itself projected an atmosphere of closed secrets and guarded grief. Franklin himself met us at the door. He was a tall, spare man of perhaps 60 years, his posture rigidly upright despite the weight of obvious strain. His face was long and pale, marked by lines that spoke of decades spent in dignified service, and a thin scar traced above his left eyebrow, an old injury that somehow added to rather than diminished his aura of quiet authority. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, each word carefully selected, as if conserving speech were a virtue practiced over many years. He led us through corridors hung with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow our progress, past rooms shrouded in holland covers and silence, to the study, where Lord Ashcombe had met his end. The room itself was a gentleman's sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crowded with leather-bound volumes, heavy curtains of deep green velvet, a Persian carpet that muffled our footsteps, and at the room's heart, a massive oak desk positioned to catch the light from tall windows overlooking the garden. The scent struck me immediately. Old leather and aged paper, certainly. But beneath these familiar library odors lurked something else. The faint, acrid tang of spilled port mixed with another smell I couldn't immediately place, something bitter and almost medicinal. A silver tray sat on the desk beside an opened decanter of brandy, two glasses arranged beside it, one showing a faint lip print at its rim, the other pristine and untouched. Lord Ashcombe himself had been removed, but Franklin described precisely how he had been found, seated upright in his chair, head tilted slightly back, eyes closed, mouth partially open in an expression that suggested neither pain nor struggle, but rather a kind of surprised stillness. His hands had been resting on the chair's arms, fingers slightly curled, displaying none of the clutching tension one might expect from a man suffering a heart attack. Franklin's account was delivered with the same careful precision that marked everything about him. I entered at precisely 11:10 to bring Lord Ashcombe his evening telegrams, as was my custom. The study door was closed, but not locked. When I entered, I immediately perceived that something was profoundly wrong. His lordship was utterly still. I approached and attempted to rouse him, but there was no response, no pulse, no breath. I immediately sent for Dr. Cartwright from the village, but it was already too late. The doctor examined his lordship and declared that his heart had failed him. Holmes moved about the room with his characteristic intensity, missing nothing. He examined the brandy glasses with particular care, holding each to the light, sniffing delicately at the residue. His nostrils flared slightly, a gesture I had learned to recognize as significant. "Watson," he said quietly, "come here and tell me what you detect." I leaned close to the glass bearing the lip print and immediately caught the scent I had noticed earlier, now concentrated and unmistakable. "Bitter almonds," I said, straightening. "Good God, Holmes, prussic acid." "Precisely. Hydrogen cyanide, to give it its proper chemical name. One of the swiftest and most deadly poisons known to science. Death would have been nearly instantaneous, leaving little time for struggle or sound. Yet the official conclusion was heart failure." Franklin's face remained impassive, but I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. "The doctor saw no signs of violence, Mr. Holmes. Lord Ashcombe had complained of chest pains in recent weeks. The conclusion seemed reasonable. Perhaps too reasonable," Holmes murmured. He turned his attention to the windows, tall French doors that opened onto the garden. One stood slightly ajar, admitting a chill draft that stirred the curtains. "These doors, were they open when you discovered his lordship?" "No, sir. They were closed but not latched. Most irregular. Lord Ashcombe was meticulous about security, particularly in recent weeks. He had become concerned about certain matters." "What sort of matters?" Franklin hesitated, and in that hesitation, I glimpsed the internal struggle of a man whose loyalty to his employer warred with the necessities of investigation. His lordship had received several threatening letters, anonymous communications, suggesting that old business associates wished to discuss certain matters with him. He dismissed them as the work of cranks, but I observed that he took precautions. He began locking doors that had previously stood open. He asked me to ensure the house was secured each night, and he requested that I leave the garden door to his study unlatched on certain evenings. Why would he make such a request? He said only that he wished to avoid being trapped should an emergency arise. But I suspected he anticipated a visitor he did not wish to admit through the front entrance, where the other servants might observe. Holmes examined the doorframe and sill with minute attention, then moved outside into the garden. The ground beneath the windows was soft from recent rain, and clear boot prints were visible in the mud. the impressions of someone who had stood for some time beneath the study windows. The prints were larger than those of Franklin or any of the household staff, as Holmes established by careful measurement and comparison. More significantly, a small fragment of grey wool cloth had snagged on a rosebush near the door, caught on a thorn and torn free when someone brushed past in haste or darkness. Holmes retrieved it carefully, holding it up to catch what little light penetrated the overcast sky. The household's routine emerged through careful questioning of the staff. Lady Ashcombe had departed for Bath 3 weeks earlier, seeking treatment for her nerves at the spa there. Their son, Paul, was at university in Cambridge, occupied with his studies. The staff consisted of Mrs. Carter, the housekeeper, a capable woman in her 50s who managed the domestic arrangements. Daisy, a young maid of perhaps 19 whose nervousness increased markedly under Holmes's gentle but persistent questions. And Jenkins, the groundskeeper, a taciturn man of indeterminate age who spoke in monosyllables when he spoke at all. Each confirmed the general routine of that fatal evening. Lord Ashcombe had dined alone at 7, taking his meal in the dining room while reading correspondence. He had retired to his study at 8:30, with instructions not to be disturbed until Franklin brought the evening telegrams at his customary time. The staff had been in their quarters by 10, following the household's usual pattern. No one had seen or heard anything unusual until Franklin raised the alarm. Yet Daisy, when questioned privately, revealed a detail that made Holmes's eyes sharpen with interest. "I saw Mr. Franklin in the corridor outside the study, sir, sometime after 10 o'clock. I couldn't sleep. My room is on the 3rd floor and gets ever so cold. So I came down to fetch another blanket from the linen cupboard. I saw him just standing there in the hall, still as a statue, staring at the study door. His face was gray as ash, sir, and when he heard me on the stairs, he turned and walked away without a word. Gave me such a fright." When Holmes confronted Franklin with this observation, the butler's composure finally showed cracks. "I was restless," he said, his voice strained. "I have been in service to this family for 40 years, Mr. Holmes. Lord Ashcombe was not merely my employer, but I have witnessed much in my time here. In recent weeks, I sensed something building toward a crisis. That evening, I could not settle. I found myself drawn to the study, though I had no reason to disturb his lordship. I stood in the corridor for perhaps 10 minutes, listening, though I knew not what I expected to hear. Then I returned to my quarters." Holmes spent the remainder of that day examining every corner of Ashcombe Manor with systematic thoroughness. He inspected Lord Ashcombe's private chambers, his correspondence, his accounts. In the library, behind a row of seemingly ordinary volumes on agricultural matters, he discovered a hidden compartment containing a black leather notebook filled with entries in cipher, abbreviations, numbers, and cryptic references that clearly represented something Lord Ashcombe had wished to keep secret. Among the coded entries, certain patterns emerged even without full decipherment. References to R appeared frequently, always in the context of sums of money and the word sapphires. The Ashcombe sapphires were legendary in county circles, a collection of extraordinarily valuable stones that had been in the family for generations, supposedly secure in the manor's vault. That evening, Holmes positioned himself in a darkened alcove near the servants' quarters and waited. His patience was rewarded near midnight when Franklin emerged from his room carrying a sealed envelope, moving with evident caution through the sleeping house. Holmes followed at a discreet distance as the butler descended to the unused wine cellar, where dusty bottles lay forgotten in their racks. There, Franklin knelt beside a loose flagstone and slid the envelope into the cavity beneath before replacing the stone and departing. Holmes waited until Franklin had returned to his quarters, then retrieved the envelope. By candlelight in the alcove, he examined its contents. A single sheet of paper, covered in the same cipher as Lord Ashcombe's hidden notebook, but clearly written in Franklin's hand. The message, when Holmes applied his considerable cryptographic skills, revealed itself as a list. Papers secured, account books hidden, family honor maintained. P. The following morning, Holmes confronted Franklin in the butler's pantry, laying out the evidence with quiet but inexorable logic. "You have been protecting someone, Mr. Franklin. The coded correspondence, your nocturnal activities, your presence outside the study at the crucial hour, all point to knowledge you have deliberately concealed. The question is, whom are you protecting, and from what?" Franklin's resistance finally crumbled. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since our arrival, genuine emotion crossed his austere features. "I protect the family name, Mr. Holmes. Lord Ashcombe's dealings in his final years were complex. He became involved in certain financial arrangements that, while not strictly illegal, would bring scandal if exposed. There are records in his study that must never become public knowledge." "What sort of arrangements?" "Loans to foreign interests, purchases made with borrowed funds. The sapphires have not been in the family vault for 3 years, Mr. Holmes. They were pawned to cover debts that Lord Ashcombe could not otherwise pay. He lived in constant fear that the truth would emerge and destroy the family's standing. And the man who made these loans, Mr. Robertson, Geoffrey Robertson, formerly a business associate of his lordship, now something darker. He held Lord Ashcombe in his power through those debts. In recent weeks, Robertson had demanded full payment, with threats of exposure. Lord Ashcombe had no means to comply." Holmes produced the fragment of grey cloth. "Mr. Robertson visited the manor on the night of Lord Ashcombe's death. These fibres match his coat, which I observed him wearing when I made discreet inquiries in the village yesterday. He gained entry through the unlocked French door at Lord Ashcombe's invitation. What happened next?" Franklin's face was ashen. "I do not know precisely. I only know that I stood vigil in the corridor, as I had done several nights when his lordship indicated he expected a visitor. I heard raised voices from the study shortly before 11, Lord Ashcombe's and another man's. Then silence. After perhaps 10 minutes, I heard the French door open and close. I immediately entered the study and found Lord Ashcombe as I described, dead in his chair, the brandy glass at his side still containing a small amount of liquid. "And you suspected murder?" "I knew it, Mr. Holmes. But I also knew that any investigation would expose the family's private disgrace. Lord Ashcombe's debts, the missing sapphires, the compromising papers, all would become public. Lady Ashcombe's fragile health would not survive such scandal. Young Paul's future would be destroyed before it could properly begin. So I made a choice." "You removed evidence. You cleaned the glass Robertson had used. You locked the French door and claimed it had been secured all evening. You summoned the doctor with a narrative prepared to suggest natural death. And you concealed the documents that would reveal your employer's financial troubles." Yes. The word was barely audible. I know it was wrong. I have betrayed my duty to truth and justice. But I could not betray my duty to the family I have served for 4 decades. I chose loyalty over law, Mr. Holmes. And I accept whatever consequences follow." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his keen eyes studying Franklin's face. Then he said quietly, "Your loyalty does you credit. But murder cannot be allowed to go unpunished, no matter how understandable your motives for concealment. We must locate Mr. Robertson and establish precisely what occurred in that study." The investigation of Geoffrey Robertson proved straightforward once Holmes set his considerable resources to the task. The man maintained rooms in London under an assumed name, but his movements were traceable through a network of informants Holmes had cultivated over years of detective work. Within 2 days, Holmes had assembled a comprehensive portrait of Robertson's activities and character. Geoffrey Robertson had indeed been a business associate of Lord Ashcombe years earlier, but their partnership had ended acrimoniously over matters neither man would discuss openly. In subsequent years, Robertson had descended into increasingly dubious financial schemes, lending money at usurious rates to gentlemen whose circumstances had become desperate. Lord Ashcombe had been far from his only victim, merely the most prominent. On the evening in question, Robertson had indeed visited Ashcombe Manor, entering through the garden door as arranged. What Holmes established through careful reconstruction and eventual confrontation was this. Lord Ashcombe had invited Robertson, intending to make one final appeal for mercy, for time to somehow raise the funds necessary to clear his debts and reclaim the family jewels. Robertson, sensing weakness, had demanded immediate payment of the full amount, or threatened exposure by week's end. The conversation had grown heated. Lord Ashcombe, driven to desperation, had poured brandy for both men in a gesture of forced civility. But in Robertson's glass, he had added a lethal dose of prussic acid, obtained from a chemist under the pretext of treating vermin in the manor's outbuildings. His intention had been murder, to silence Robertson permanently and destroy the evidence of his debts, along with the only man who could prove them. But the plan went catastrophically wrong. Robertson, suspicious by nature and practiced in detecting poisons through long association with criminals, had detected something amiss in the color or odor of his drink. Rather than consuming it, he had switched the glasses when Lord Ashcombe turned to close the garden door. Lord Ashcombe, believing his trap had been refused, had himself drunk from what he thought was the unpoisoned glass, and died almost instantly. Robertson, horrified despite his criminal nature by the unexpected turn of events, had fled the manor in panic, leaving Lord Ashcombe dead by his own hand, though not by his own intention. It was this flight that had torn the fragment of cloth from his coat and left the boot prints Holmes had discovered. Holmes arranged for Robertson's arrest on charges of blackmail and illegal money lending, though murder could not be proved, given that Lord Ashcombe had prepared and administered the poison himself, albeit with fatal misidentification. The exposure of Lord Ashcombe's financial difficulties proved unavoidable, but Holmes worked with the family solicitor to minimize the scandal. The debts were settled through sale of estate properties. The sapphires were recovered from the pawnbroker who had held them, and young Paul was able to complete his education without the complete destruction of the family name. Lady Ashcombe, informed of the circumstances by Holmes with careful consideration for her delicate health, bore the revelation with more strength than anyone had anticipated. "My husband lived in constant fear," she said quietly. "Perhaps now he has found the peace that eluded him in life." As for Franklin, Holmes argued successfully against any criminal prosecution for his concealment of evidence, emphasizing that the butler's actions, while legally questionable, had been motivated entirely by loyalty rather than personal gain. Franklin remained in service to the Ashcombe family, though the weight of what he had witnessed and concealed was visible in the deepening lines of his austere face. On our final day at Ashcombe Manor, as Holmes and I prepared to return to London, Franklin approached us in the entrance hall. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I have spent 40 years learning to serve in silence. I have prided myself on discretion, on keeping the family's confidences, on presenting to the world only what should be seen, while concealing all that should remain hidden." I believed this was the highest form of loyalty. "And now?" Holmes asked. "Now I wonder if true loyalty might sometimes require speaking rather than silence. If I had brought Lord Ashcombe's troubles to light earlier, sought help before crisis became catastrophe, might he still be alive? I shall carry that question for whatever years remain to me." Holmes placed a hand briefly on the old butler's shoulder, a gesture of rare physical contact from a man who typically maintained careful distance. "We cannot know what might have been, Mr. Franklin. We can only act according to the light given us in each moment. You acted according to principles you had honored for a lifetime. That you now question those principles speaks well of your capacity for growth even in your later years. Few men manage such wisdom. As our carriage rolled away from Ashcombe Manor, Holmes sat in unusual silence, gazing back at the receding house until fog swallowed it from view. "A curious case, Watson," he said finally. "Murder that was not murder, yet resulted in death nonetheless. A servant whose loyalty led him to conceal evidence, yet whose conscience ultimately brought truth to light. A gentleman who planned murder to escape shame, yet became victim of his own lethal intentions." "What will you write in your records?" I asked. "The truth, as always. But perhaps this case will be one I do not encourage you to publish during our lifetimes. There are some secrets that serve a legitimate purpose, even after they have been uncovered. The silent butler's secret may deserve to remain partially silent still. I have honored that request until now." Franklin passed away peacefully 5 years after these events, carrying with him to the grave the full burden of knowledge he had borne for those final years. Lady Ashcombe lived another decade, finding in her later years a measure of peace her husband never knew. Young Paul inherited what remained of the estate and managed it with prudence his father had lacked, slowly rebuilding the family's fortunes and reputation. As for the lesson Holmes drew from this case, he expressed it to me one evening years later as we sat before the fire at Baker Street. "The greatest tragedies, Watson, are often those where every participant acts from understandable motives. Yet the convergence of those actions produces disaster. Lord Ashcombe sought to protect his family's honor through murder. Robertson sought only to collect debts legally owed. Franklin sought to serve loyalties cultivated over decades. Yet these 3 men, each following his own conception of proper conduct, created circumstances that led to unnecessary death and years of suffering. It is a reminder that good intentions are not sufficient guides to proper action. We must also consider consequences, anticipate unintended results, and occasionally question even our most deeply held principles. This was the case of the silent butler's secret, a mystery where the crime was both clear and obscure, where loyalty and criminality intermingled until one could scarcely distinguish between them, and where the final accounting revealed that justice, like truth, sometimes wears an unexpected face.